We got the latest updates for the Falcons' ongoing search for a new head coach. And we'll also talk about how the Rooney Rule will impact their final decision.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, who can help you find qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. You may know me as Sirius Black. You may know me as Mr. Drew. You may know me as Mr. AKA. And of course, guys, I appreciate each and every one of you that does know me because you tune in each and every day as an everydayer. Shout out to you guys that make this podcast your first listen or first watch each and every day, and to become an everydayer so that you can get to know me better. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we're going to be beginning our reviews of each position group from this past season, starting with the quarterback. So we'll be reviewing Desmond Ridder's disappointing 2023 season and where things went wrong. We'll look ahead at the plethora of options in terms of what new direction the Falcons could take at the quarterback position in 2024. But we'll start with an update on the Falcons' ongoing search for a head coach. It's been an interesting weekend in that regard. You know, after the increased buzz from this past Thursday that the Falcons were seemingly all in on Bill Belichick, you know, due to him coming in for a second in-person interview in front of the entire brass on Friday, there's been a little bit of pushback, just a sliver of pushback against it over the weekend. The smart money still remains that Belichick is going to be the next head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, mostly due to various reports indicating that Arthur Blank really wants him. He's driving that bus. But there's been a couple of insiders, a little trickling here and there of suggesting maybe it's not quite the slam dunk that it previously has been led to believe. And, you know, right now my read on that is that's mostly a hedge. But we'll see if that picks up more momentum in the coming days. That will absolutely be music to my ears. But a lot of that is due to the Falcons are continuing their sort of robust search, looking at other candidates or lining up second interviews. But they did conduct some first interviews with some candidates over the weekend. Friday, Lions DC Aaron Glenn. Saturday, Bills offensive coordinator Joe Brady and Rams defensive coordinator Raheem Morris. Sunday, they talked with Texans OC Bobby Slowick. They were scheduled to speak with Lions OC Ben Johnson on Saturday, but according to an NFL Network report, time sort of ran out on that, and they're going to still try to interview him after the Lions-Bucks playoff game on Sunday. As of this recording, with that game ongoing, that hasn't happened yet, obviously, but presumably, even if it doesn't happen Sunday night, you know, that will happen in the coming days. And so, again, you're starting to hear more chatter that Belichick to Atlanta isn't quite the slam dunk as it seemed to be, you know, on my last episode that I recorded. And the name that seems to be getting more buzz than most of these sort of alternative options, if it's not Belichick, seems to be Raheem Morris. We'll see. But the Falcons, again, have second interviews lined up. Jim Harbaugh, Bengals offensive coordinator Brian Callahan is another person they want to speak to. Those chats and interviews are TBD, to be determined, but they do have scheduled first interview with Mike Vrabel, the ex-Titans head coach, come Wednesday. So we're basically back to where I was, not on the most recent episode where I was very, you know, in my feelings, but before, where it was like, okay, this process is going to play out over the next couple of weeks. And some of that is owed to me having a better understanding of how the Rooney Rule is going to apply to the Falcons situation. You know, up until this week is the first week where teams can have in-person meetings with coaches, right, that are currently employed by NFL teams. So with Belichick, with Harbaugh, Vrabel would be another example of this. You know, those don't count. They can have those in-person meetings up until this week because they currently don't have NFL jobs. However, the Rooney rules state that you can't make your hire until you have two in-person interviews with minority candidates that are outside your organization. So New England was able to skirt this technically because they had a league approved clause written in Jared Mayo's contract a few years ago. The Raiders were compliant before they hired Antonio Pierce. I believe of the remaining 6 vacancies, the Chargers are the only team that is currently Rooney Rule compliant. And there's been a little bit of controversy with the term, quote unquote, Rooney Rule compliance, because it's related to the idea of, oh, you're just checking boxes before you actually go out there and get your, quote unquote, real head coach. And I certainly think that's a worthwhile conversation to have. We're not going to have it on today's episode. I'm using that term more as a timeline standpoint in terms of when the Falcons could make their hire, due to my mistake that on the last episode, I kind of implied that we are days away potentially from hiring Bill Belichick. That's not the case, right? Now, when it comes to the Rooney Rule and my thoughts on it, and this is one of the reasons why I was more optimistic than others that going into this process, that the Falcons would, quote unquote, come to their senses and not hire a dud like Bill Belichick, because I was, optimistic that, this would be a great opportunity for the Falcons to hire their first permanent minority head coach, right? We've had some interim coaches like Raheem Morris, Emmett Thomas in the past, but nobody who's permanently had that job. And before I get some angry comments, of people saying, oh, you don't like Belichick because he's white. It's like, no, I don't like Belichick because I think his style of coaching is from a bygone era. I think he's a short-term fix that's not really fixing anything, and instead he's tearing everything down. Like you're bringing in a plumber to fix the leaky faucet and then he rips out the entire sink. And it's like, all right, like, what are you doing, my guy? But, on the notion of white coaches, like, there are several that I would love the Falcons hire, right? Ben Johnson, Bobby Slowick, Brian Callahan, Mike McDonald. Go back over the last 10 days of this podcast, and I've given a plethora of reasons why I think any of those guys would be great hires, right? But for me specifically, in this particular cycle, I thought there were also equally or more qualified black head coaches like Morris, like Ejiro Evero, Steve Wilkes, Anthony Weaver in this cycle. And again, who knows what the future holds for the Atlanta Falcons, but to me, this is as good as ever of an opportunity for the Falcons to make that sort of history by hiring their first black head coach. Now, I know there's going to be a couple of you guys that are saying like, you feel compelled to sit there and share like, well, I don't care about race and it shouldn't be a factor in this. And it's like, you are entitled to that opinion, but no one cares, right? Some people want an offensive minded coach, some like a defensive minded coach. Some people want a coach with experience. Some, don't like retreads, different strokes for different folks. I have no problem with people sharing their preferences, emphasis on that word, and why they have them. But I think belittling others because they have the audacity to have a slightly different preference than you in terms of who they want as the Falcons head coach, doesn't make sense. It's like, you prefer chocolate ice cream. I prefer vanilla ice cream. You want chocolate syrup. You want caramel syrup on your sundae. You want rainbow sprinkles, chocolate sprinkles, cherry on top, no cherry on top. We all can sit here and wax poetic about what we personally think the perfect sundae is, but, everybody else is entitled to what their taste is. And, the difference is that I have a platform and a microphone and someone pays me to basically come on a podcast each and every day and tell you what my perfect sundae is. So, that's the difference between me and you. But those are my thoughts on that. We'll continue to give you updates on the coaching search as the week wears on and we get more information on that front. But we're going to move on to a slightly less controversial subject, which is Falcons quarterback Desmond Ridder. And we'll talk about where his 2023 season went wrong. So it's the start of the new year, and every small business and even big business like the Atlanta Falcons are asking themselves the same question: what's the one hire I can make that can take my business to the next level in 2024? And LinkedIn Jobs can help out you as a small business owner, not quite the Atlanta Falcons, because they know that success depends on the team that you surround yourself, and they've created the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn Jobs is not just any old job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion, and I mean 1 billion with a B, guys, professionals, which make it the best place to hire. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. If only that was the case for NFL coaching searches. But LinkedIn Jobs is here, guys, to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 YouTube streaming channel, the first of its kind, giving you the biggest stories on all the biggest sports across the nation, across the world. Now, if you're looking for a more local flavor for your ice cream sundae, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube, where you can get updates on the Falcons, Braves, Bulldogs, Hawks, so much more here in the state of Georgia. So, talking about the 2023 season at the quarterback position, obviously Desmond Ridder disappointed us, right? Didn't live up to expectations. I don't think it was a disastrous year, as some might portray it, but clearly he did not live up to expectations, right? You know, with so many things I've talked about with the Falcons 2023 season, I think he got 90% of the way to where we wanted him to go, and that last 10% was elusive. Although, probably, if we're really being hyper specific about Desmond Ridder, maybe that's 75% of the way there as opposed to 90%. But, I don't prescribe to the theory that rolling with Ridder was a poor choice by the Falcons, was the wrong choice with the Falcons. Again, you did not get the desired result, but I don't think it was due to a bad process. I've seen the narrative over the last few months that, the Falcons should have given Ridder more snaps in the preseason. I've also seen the narrative that they should have given him less snaps during the summer because they wanted him to compete for his job, which is basically what that does, is it reduces the number of reps you get with the starters. And I don't think either one of those issues led to his struggles, right? I think that's just silly for people to think that. Now, of course, there's been a lot of talk, especially recently, about the alternative options that the Falcons could have taken at the quarterback position this past offseason, such as trading up for one in the draft or going after Lamar Jackson. Again, I don't think those narratives quite factor in the reality that the Falcons probably, if they had gone after those guys, sure, they probably would have gotten better quarterback play, but they probably would have made the rest of their roster worse because they couldn't invest those resources into those areas. And of course, we'll talk about over the course of this week and upcoming weeks about those rest of the roster areas that also disappointed and let down this team in 2023. But it's more than fair to say that probably the number one most glaring weakness on this team this past season was their subpar quarterback play. And, we'll talk more about those other areas. But again, that does not mean that there are other areas weren't also equally disappointing, which was a big factor in why this entire 2023 season was so disappointing to us all. But, why the quarterback play was the most glaring issue, mostly simple turnovers, right? They could not protect the ball, right? Neither of the starting quarterbacks, in Desmond Ridder or Taylor Heineke. And you probably heard me say previously on the podcast where I feel like there were like 8 games where turnovers were really backbreaking. It doesn't mean that the other 9 games, they were a non-issue. I just didn't see them as those sort of backbreaking issues. Now, those 8 games, if you're curious, to me were Jacksonville game in week 4, week 6 against Washington, both Tampa Bay games in week 7 and 14, week 9 against the Vikings, week 15 against the Panthers, week 17 against the Bears, and week 18 against the Saints. Now, I'm sure you guys might add other games or subtract games from your own personal list, but that's just personally mine. Obviously, Ridder started 6 out of those 8 games. And to summarize Ridder's season, I thought in the first month of the season, the first 4 games up through the Jacksonville game, a lot of the turnover issues were related to very questionable decision-making. I think from week 5 through roughly week 13, including his first benching, I thought the turnover issues were much more forgivable issues. Not acceptable, but forgivable because, like, example, against Washington in the first Saints game, a lot of those interceptions to me were him and his receivers not being on the right page, right? You had the fumbles against Tampa Bay in week 7 and Tennessee the following week, which, theoretically a fumble is a fixable issue because you can, coach up ball security, and then the, getting more reps with his receivers, could have theoretically allowed those guys to get on the right page, more reps in the regular season, not reps in the preseason, guys, because you're going up against vanilla defenses. That's not really helping guys like, they're running the most basic coverages and whatnot. But anyway, and all of that contributed to why I thought the first benching that happened in week 9 was unwarranted by Arthur Smith. I think that was arguably the biggest mistake Arthur Smith made this past season. I'll continue to die on the hill that had Ridder started against Minnesota and Arizona, I think those games are much more likely to be W's rather than losses than they were with Heineke, as they were. Now, again, despite my optimism for Ridder going into the season, I didn't have high hopes for Ridder this season. Like I expected him to be basically the 19th best quarterback. And I figured, hey, if the rest of the team does what we think it's going to do, the run game, the defense, etc., that's going to be good enough against this soft schedule in this poor division to make the playoffs. And, again, I think we got like 90% of the way there. And, at the time of Ridder's first benching in week 9, he was the 20th best quarterback in the NFL, according to adjusted net yards per attempt. And so that's part of the reason why I think like we almost got there. Right now, the decision-making issues that plagued Ridder at the beginning of the season reared their ugly head after that week 13 win against the Jets, right? We saw that in the following week against Tampa Bay, the Carolina game after that, and then the finale against the Saints, right? And the Bucks game was sort of that pivotal moment where it seemed like all roads were leading to Ridder having this sort of breakthrough performance due to him playing well, despite the fumbles in that first Bucks game. But that was a road game, and given that we know Ridder was much better at home than he was on the road, having that week 14 game at home, you felt like, okay, he's going to step up and have that breakthrough performance. He didn't step up, and it kind of took all the wind out of the sails for the season. And then he followed that up against Carolina with the very poor decision at the end of the game that essentially threw that game away with that interception that led to his second benching. And then coming back in week 18 after Heineke's injury against the Saints, he was reasonably solid in the first half, putting the Falcons in a position to be in a position to win that game. But then at the beginning of the second half on that opening drive in the third quarter, made another poor decision that led to an interception, and things kind of derailed from that. And sort of summarizes kind of the entire season of the Falcons, those, first few drives in that Saints game. And so that, to me, those last couple of games really showed the regression from Ridder that kind of killed any hope for him. And that's why I've been asked by several fans and listeners over the past month, is there any chance for redemption from Ridder moving forward? And my response has kind of been an emphatic no, not because it's impossible, but like, there's certainly a scenario where, whoever the Falcons' next starter is, misses 8 games, and Ridder is forced back into the lineup and plays really well. Theoretically, he could do that during that stretch. But that's really more of a happy accident than sort of any sort of plan or strategy that the Falcons should engage with moving forward. And, we've touched upon this before with first round quarterbacks and what makes them different from other quarterbacks, but it's probably true of all players. First round players tend to get multiple chances to succeed or fail, while everybody else basically gets one shot. And, if you fail, that's probably it. Now, maybe there's a Geno Smith-like path for Desmond Ridder down the road where he might get a chance at redemption years from now, but that's probably not going to happen in Atlanta, right? It took Geno, changing teams 4 times after he left New York, and then 8 years for him to sort of come back around again as a viable starter in this league. And, I think if there's any sort of silver lining to this season, like, okay, well, the Falcons have a halfway decent backup in Desmond Ridder. He's probably, due to the experience and at least the potential he showed, like he might be a halfway decent and one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. But that's really all I think the Falcons can expect from him moving forward, at least for the next 2 years that he is under contract. So we will talk about the other 2 quarterbacks on the roster, Taylor Heineke and Logan Woodside, what's next for them, as well as what's next for this team as a whole and the many different directions that they may take at the quarterback position in 2024 to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So a NFL regular season has wrapped. Playoffs are ongoing, but there's still time to get in on the action at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. You got to love FanDuel. The app is easy to use. There's so many different betting options, spreads, player props, over-unders. You can go and do live same-game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can find a parlay in the Parlay Hub. That's the best way to find popular parlays so you can bet a little and win a lot. So go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup this NFL postseason. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. So wrapping up today's episode, want to plug, what your first listen will be on tomorrow's episode. Again, any updates on the coaching search will continue there. We'll also talk about the running back position, probably talking about, Bijan Robinson's very successful rookie season, but why, still left a little bit of a bitter taste in our mouth. Like, what's that taste? Like, it didn't quite live up to the hype in a lot of ways, but, we'll talk about the overhype and all that sort of stuff. And what's next for the Falcons. But, what's next for the Falcons at quarterback position on today's episode, and before we get into that, let's talk about the other quarterbacks at the position, Taylor Heinicke and Logan Woodside. I don't expect them to be back on the Falcons roster in 2024. Maybe the Falcons surprise me with that. I think both are quote unquote Arthur Smith guys. The Falcons are going to save $7 million by cutting Taylor Heinicke. I suspect that the new coach, the new coordinator is going to bring in their own two guys. And I think it's very likely that the Falcons are going to add both a veteran and a draft pick this offseason. And those two guys plus Desmond Ridder are probably going to be the three main quarterbacks you bring into training camp. And Desmond Ridder could be on the roster bubble for that reason, depending on how much the Falcons invest in those two other players, right? For example, if they were to take a quarterback in round 1 or 2, that's going to put Ridder firmly on the bubble. But if for whatever reason they waited till round 5 or 6 to draft that quarterback, then Ridder probably would be the front runner to be the QB2 going into this upcoming season. But, how long the Falcons wait on a quarterback in the draft in April, I think was going to heavily depend on how much they are willing to invest in a veteran in March. So, for example, if they were to land, say, a Kirk Cousins or a Russell Wilson, I'm just saying these names for illustrative purposes, I don't think they'll be as compelled to use a first or second round pick on a quarterback in the draft. But if they were to land instead, say Jacoby Brissett or Gardner Minshew, that's probably going to lead them to drafting a quarterback in round 1 or round 2 or something like that. Now, Justin Fields could technically split the difference of being the veteran option, but also require an investment of a relatively high pick, probably a day 2 pick, assuming that he's going to be traded by the Chicago Bears, which I think is a safe assumption at this point in time, right? And that would kind of stand in for the Falcons using that high pick on a draft pick, and maybe push them to waiting onto like day 3 to draft that quarterback in addition to adding Fields. Now, I know Mel Kiper recently suggested that the Bears could get a first round pick for Justin Fields. We're going to put that take in the same bucket of takes that, had Mel pushing Will Levis as QB1 last year as something that I don't think is likely to happen. Now, for whichever team acquires Fields, I doubt they're going to give him the 5th-year option. It's going to be instead a 1-year rental going into the final year of his contract. It'll otherwise kind of be a Sam Darnold situation if a team gives him that 5th-year option, because as you may recall, a few years ago, the Panthers stupidly gave Darnold his 5th-year option and locked themselves into a second year of a massive amount of guaranteed money. I don't expect any team to make that same mistake with Fields, given that his 5th-year option in 2025 would mean that he would get, it's projected to be about $22 million in guaranteed money. Instead, I think you just let Fields play it out. And then if he plays well, then you might franchise tag him. Now, the franchise tag is projected to be upwards of like $40 million, but guaranteeing $22 million sight unseen to me is much less forgivable than say, well, if he plays well, then he gets an $18 million pay bump in that regard. And theoretically you would be like, oh, he's worth it now because we've actually seen him perform. But when it comes to the rookies, there's certainly a good chance, decent to good, depending on how you want to describe it, that the Falcons take a quarterback in round 1. I think a lot of that will depend on the coach, right? Trading up is definitely a possibility. I know there's going to be, in terms of teams that are going to be talked about as most likely to trade up, the Falcons will probably be listed on that list of possibilities. Now, if they do hire Bill Belichick as their head coach, the chances of them trading up kind of plummet because he's only traded up 3 times over the last 24 years that he's been essentially running the Patriots drafts. Now, I've joked with some folks in the Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below, that, maybe we get YOLO Bill, right? You only live once Bill, a guy that's now approaching retirement, and he's basically saying, okay, I'm going to do things completely differently than I've done for the last quarter century. I don't think that's going to happen, but maybe YOLO Bill will be much more willing to trade up than old Bill. Whatever the opposite of YOLO is. So as we sit here today talking about a trade up, I doubt the Bears or Commanders, who hold the number 1 and 2 picks, are going to want to move back all the way to 8. I could see a scenario where those two teams swap because, Caleb Williams is a hometown Washington guy and they hold 2 pick, and maybe they'll give enough for the Bears to be like, okay, well, we'll settle for Drake May at number 2 and also get, whatever picks you want to throw us. So I think if the Falcons are to trade up, we've discussed this previously on the podcast, I think it's far more likely that they'll be able to go up to 3 or 4 with New England or Arizona, to trade up for that guy and get probably who's going to be the third quarterback in this draft, which the presumptive favorite sitting here today, we'll see how this develops over the next 3 months, is LSU's Jaden Daniels. Now, if the Falcons don't trade up, could a quarterback fall to them at 8? That's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible because, again, there's so many quarterback needy teams picking after the Falcons that I would expect one of those teams to kind of jump up and leapfrog the Falcons to go get whoever that QB3 is. Could all 3 quarterbacks go early and then the Falcons are stuck taking the 4th quarterback at 8? I think that's a much more likely scenario than say Jaden Daniels falling to 8, but we'll see how that plays out. I think the 4th quarterback is most likely to be Michigan quarterback JJ McCarthy. That seems to be where the current buzz is going. Now, I know he's not currently projected to go that high by a lot of draft experts, but we'll see what happens over the next 3 months. We know that players can rise up the board. For example, the Athletics' Dane Brugler in his most recent mock draft, and Dane is one of the most plugged in draft analysts out there. Personally, he's number 1 in my book. Recently mocked JJ McCarthy to 19 in his recent mock draft. And that's notable because a year ago, at the same time he mocked Anthony Richardson number 15 in his mock draft. We saw Richardson rise up 11 spots to pick number 4 in last year's draft. What if JJ McCarthy rises up 11 spots from 19 to number 8 overall, where the Atlanta Falcons are picking? Could that happen? Will that happen? We shall see. But I think it's definitely a possibility. Now, I could very easily see the Falcons go with another position, maybe a pass rusher at 8, something like that, and wait for the quarterback on day 2. I think if Bill Belichick is hired, that's probably the most likely outcome. The Senior Bowl guys make a ton of sense. The Patriots historically like Senior Bowl quarterbacks. We know the Terry Fontenot with Arthur Smith preferred Senior Bowl prospects as well, and that may continue with Terry still being here and hopefully having some sort of role and say in who the next Falcons quarterback is going to be. We'll see if that's the case with Bill Belichick. But, and sort of the top Senior Bowl guys are guys like Oregon's Bo Nix, Washington's Michael Penix Jr., South Carolina's Spencer Rattler, Tennessee's Joe Milton, and Tulane's Michael Pratt. And I'm probably forgetting somebody else that's also headed to the Senior Bowl. So those are probably, I would guess at this point in time, Penix and Nix are probably most likely to be round 2 options, but some of those other guys maybe later in the draft, or if they have a good Senior Bowl week, they could rise up boards. But that will be a conversation that we'll be having next week on the podcast, because I will be attending the Senior Bowl again for the second time this year down in Mobile, and we'll talk about some of those quarterbacks and all that. So that's more of a conversation. So those are, again, we're early in this process until the Falcons have hired a head coach, until they've hired an offensive coordinator, until, we figure out who they're going to sign in free agency. What they do in the draft is, that will continue to be speculation throughout the offseason, but a lot of options, a lot of paths that the Falcons can take is basically what I'm going on. And until we start to nail down some of these, hires and jobs and whatnot, we won't really know what path they're going to be on. But if I was, speculating, I think they'll sign a sort of bridge starter in free agency. As much as I know people want that to be Kirk Cousins, I wouldn't bet on that at this point in time. But again, we'll see how that goes at this point. I talked about Kirk Cousins, back in December about he would be the preferred option. I still probably think that, but it doesn't seem as likely that he's going to hit the market as some people think. But we'll see how that plays. They go for a bridge starter. They use an early round pick on a quarterback as a developmental sort of heir apparent type of player. And Desmond Ridder will also be there as well. And so that's probably what's going to happen. But again, who those specific guys are, we shall see. But that's going to do it for us here, guys. We'll be back tomorrow, talk more running backs, give more updates on the coaching search, anything else that comes along. Of course, would love to hear your feedback on today's topics in the comments. Check us out in the Discord as well. Link in the description below. Also become a Locked On Falcons insider, right? Where you can get access to all 22 reviews, extended all 22 reviews from this past season. We'll probably break into some Senior Bowl quarterback film this week as a Locked On Falcon insider. So hit that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. It's a 14-day free trial, and then it's $4.99 a month after that. So check it out. That's going to do it for us, guys. Appreciate it. Continue to check out Locked On Sports today. Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 YouTube streaming channel. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On Bucks, Locked On Lions, Locked On Packers, Locked On everything to get the latest updates on all this weekend's playoff action. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.